Willowbrook. This is Denise Wing. I'm your Madison Women's Ministry Associate, and I am so happy to share the deep dive with you today. The subject that we're going to talk about is a little bit more challenging, but it's a big part of the story, right? So we need to read the whole thing. We need to know. So we're going to talk about John chapter 19, starting in verses 28, and we're going to go through 37, and this is when Jesus dies. And a couple things that I want to share with you about this portion of scripture is two things. One is Jesus very intentional in his actions. He was very purposeful. He knew what he was doing. He had a plan and he was following it. The second was his mission was fulfilled. So let's look at the scripture, and starting in verse 28, it says, after this, so what's, yesterday we did the part, we talked about the part where John is given to his mother and to Jesus's mother, and they're going to take care of each other. John's going to take care of Jesus's mama. I think that's awesome. And he says, so after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, there's the key right there. He knew that all things were accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled. He said, I thirst. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there. They filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on the hyssop, and put it in his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. That's super impactful, right? It could be very traumatic when we think about that whole process and what he was going through, what he was dealing with, and how difficult it was for him, and the pain and all the different things that he was dealing with. But we know how it ends, right? He willingly did this for us. He gave up his spirit. And then in the next part is where they pierced his side. So they went to go check. They didn't want him to stay on the crosses overnight because of the preparation day. It says it was preparation day, and they shouldn't remain on the cross over the Sabbath. And so they got permission to go break the legs of the people so that they would die quicker. Well, they get to Jesus, of course, and he is already dead. And so they pierced his side. And so if you jump down to verse, let's look at verse 34. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth. And this is another part I want you to focus on. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he's telling the truth. Why? So that you would believe. So that you would believe in Jesus and the price that he paid for you. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they pierced. So everything was fulfilled that Jesus had been put on this earth to do, that he came to do, to redeem us. And so the 2 points, again, that I wanted to share with you was the first one being that Jesus was very intentional in his actions. He was purposeful. He knew what he was supposed to do, and he embraced it. He took it on. The part of the scripture where it talks about how when he was in the garden and he was praying and he was sweating blood and he's saying, God, if there's any way that this can pass from me, if there's any other way that this could happen, let it be so. But nonetheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so he embraced it, and he knew that that was the plan. And so he took it on and he continued it. And the second point that I want you to consider is his mission was fulfilled. Completely fulfilled. His mission was fulfilled, and he knew that. And so what I want to ask you about today is, how can you be more intentional? I feel like God's been talking to me a lot about that this year, about my actions being intentional, my time being intentional, using that, doing the things that God has asked me to do. How am I being intentional in my walk with God? Am I intentionally? Now, if you're doing the deep dive, of course, you're being intentional about that, and that's great. Continue in it for sure. But are we being intentional in our prayer time, in sitting and hearing what God is talking to us about? Like, what is he speaking to you about? Are you being intentional in your ministry? Are you being intentional in your marriage? Are you being intentional in your parenting, in your career? If you're, working, all the different things that we are to manage in our life, we need to be intentional that we would purpose to do what God has put us on this earth to do. His ministry is in everything that we do. We need to open our eyes to see what God is doing and join him in that. I've talked about that before. God is always working around us, always. He's never stopping. Are we being intentional to notice? Are we being intentional to join him so that his will can be done in our life and in the life of the people that he brings us into contact with? So I'd ask you to just consider that. Be intentional so that you fulfill the purpose that God put you on this earth to do. Love you all. See you next time.